After seeing the production function, we're going to move on to different cost functions and cost curves. And these concepts are extremely important in the upcoming chapters. And I'm just going to compare and contrast some of the differences with the production function, but it's based a lot upon what we've just learned under the production function. So here we have our usual scenario, as we mentioned before, that we have a mixture of total costs and a mixture of variable costs and fixed costs, which make up for our total costs. And just to kind of highlight the differences between the two, the variable costs essentially are the costs that vary with the amount produced. So if you think about running a coffee shop, well, your variable cost could be your amount of workers hired, because if you don't want to produce much or you decide not to produce anything, you don't need any workers. As the more and more you want to produce coffees, well, then you have to hire more and more workers. As you hire more, as you want to produce more and more, well, you'll have to buy and use more coffee grains, more electricity, more water, more of different types of maybe disposable cups and stuff like that. So all of those are variable costs. Essentially, what I try to think about is variable costs are the costs that would disappear if I decided not to open up my store today. Whereas fixed costs are the other ones. Fixed costs are costs that don't vary with the amount of output produced. So if I think of my fixed costs in this case compared to my variable costs, well, on a very short-term basis, if I decide not to open today, well, I still have to pay for my rent. I still have to pay for my insurance. I still have to pay for a bunch of different things. I might still have to pay for basic electricity just to keep the fridges running and different things like that. But I have a certain set of costs that will still be there if I decide to shut down. Those are my fixed costs. And part of fixed costs, we say that fixed costs have what we call sunk cost. Okay, and sunk cost, is just like you're sinking the water. It's gone. It's disappeared. It's costs that are incurred in the past, and you shouldn't take into account when you're making your production decisions, because it might be bad decisions you've made in the past. So if you're deciding whether you should stay open or not today, it should not be based on maybe money that you've lost in the past. Building your website was a very bad idea, didn't bring enough money back, and different things like that. So your sunk costs are part of fixed costs. They're both kind of linked together. So it's this idea that you made a bad decision. That's too bad. However, don't keep on making bad decisions with regards to your production process. So what are the different cost curves that we're going to be looking at? The main one here is our marginal costs. Because we have the marginal word once again, well, we know it's going to relate to changes, as we have here the two symbols that represent a change in total costs over a change in output. So we have the different situations here, and we'll have our three different average total costs. So similar to the production function, but we have one marginal and three averages in this case here. The big thing that has to be highlighted, and I will say it loud and clear here, is that in this case here, we're looking at change in total costs over change in total output. So here, when we reflect this Q here, we're talking about output. Here, output, output, output. All of these quantities are output. Okay, we are not dividing by amount of labor. This is not labor. This is not labor that we're dealing with here. Because otherwise, if we're dealing with labor and we're going to be looking, let's say I'll fast track here to average variable costs, well, it's my variable cost over my quantity of output. However, if it was my variable cost over my quantity of input, well, if I think I hire an extra worker, going from 1 to 2, my variable cost, if it's only workers, would double. And if my quantity of worker doubles, well, that AVC will not be changing. It's not an interesting concept. So all of these have to deal with quantity of output. Very important. So here it's my change in total costs over my change in total output. When we deal with the different averages, it's going to be my total cost divided by output, fixed cost divided by output, variable cost divided by output. So they're all very similar. I am simply dividing total cost, fixed cost, and variable cost by output to obtain average total cost, average fixed cost, and average variable cost. Okay. All of these will serve a purpose, especially marginal cost, average total cost, and average variable cost, when it comes time to determining production decisions. So let's calculate these three cost curves with this basic table. This table, you could just imagine that only this part here would be given to you, the first two columns, and the cost of the factory and the cost of the workers. So if I ignore this portion here and I ask myself, well, what's my total cost? Let's just start with total cost. If I have 0 workers, well, I'm not hiring any workers. My cost of my factory is 30. This would be the case. If I have 1 worker, well, I'll have that 30 to pay for plus the 10 of the 1 worker and so on. So for every worker, my costs go up by 10, which are my variable costs, because throughout the whole time, my fixed costs have stayed the same at 30. So that's the easy way that these 3 columns have been determined, is simply by looking at the different input levels and the information that we have with regards to the cost of the factory and the cost of the workers. This information here would be kind of the information that's given in the context of a situation like we had before, potentially this idea of specialization and then diminishing marginal product of labor. We actually have the exact same example here, where the productivity of the first worker is 40 units, then the second worker is 50 due to the specialization. And as I keep moving along, the last worker only produces an extra 10 units of output because of diminishing marginal product of labor. Okay. So as I mentioned, to calculate average fixed cost, it's simply fixed cost divided by output. And this context here, these first 3 would be seen as not available. Okay, I wouldn't be able to calculate these 3 because you cannot divide by 0. However, if I start with these ones moving down, well, what would be my average fixed cost? Well, my average fixed cost is fixed cost divided by output, not input. So here I would have 30 divided by 40, which is 3/4 or 0.75. What would be my average variable cost? 10 divided by 40, which is 1/4 or 0.25. And my total cost would be 40 divided by 40, which would be equal to 1. Okay. To verify if this works, you could verify this equation here, because if you're taking an equation such as total cost is equal to fixed cost plus variable cost, if you divide both sides of any equation by the same thing, the equation still holds. So if I divide both sides by Q, I get average total cost is equal to average fixed cost plus average variable cost. So here 3/4 plus 1/4 is equal to 1. Yes. I could do the same thing for this one here. So here I have 30 divided by 90. That's going to be 1/3. 20 divided by 90, 2/9. And then 50 divided by 90, 5/9. So I have 3/9, 2/9, and now 5/9. So this also adds up. And then I could do the same for this and this one and this one. Okay. And the results that you would obtain would be what I have here. How about marginal costs? Well, with marginal costs, which is going to be one of the big ones to remember, it's going to be my change in my total costs. And because we're dealing with change here, it could also be seen as change in variable costs, because the change in total cost from here to here is going to be 10. From here to here is going to be 10, here to here 10, or from here to here 20, here to here 20. Whereas fixed cost doesn't change. So it could be change in total cost or change in variable cost. Depending on the textbook you have, you might see something a little different. Over my change in output. Okay. So it has to be between 2 spots as we had before. So I'm just gonna set this up in purple so you don't mistake it with what we have here. So between 0 and 1 worker, I don't want to get confused with this section here, because the problem with people when we calculate the different average fixed costs, total costs, and marginal costs is that often people divide it by the quantity of workers. So I just scratched it out to make sure we don't make that mistake. So if I go from this point to this point, I'm going from 0 to 40 output. So what do I have? Well, I have an increase in 10 of costs for an increase in 40 of output. Okay. Over here, from here to here, I still have an increase in 10 of costs for an increase of 50 in output. Still an increase of 10 for an increase of 30. An increase in 10 for an increase of 20. Increase in 10 for an increase in 10. So I could see here I have about a quarter of marginal costs. Now it moves to 0.2. Then it moves to a third, which is 0.33. Moves to a half, 0.5, to 1. So the marginal cost curve is going to have this shape that's going to start going down and then back up. Okay? And if you wanted to see the results in decimal form, you have them in your slides. So what will these three cost curves look like? If I were to draw them out, so I have the information here, I'll just draw them out fast. However, if you were to point them point by point, you would have something, a very similar shape than what I will have. So how will this be set up? Well, my costs here, and whether it's average fixed costs, average total costs, average variable costs, or marginal costs, will be represented here. And this will be my quantity of output. Okay, important that it's output. The three different cost curves will have a similar shape in the sense that this will be marginal costs. Average variable costs will look something like this if you were to draw it out. Average total costs will be higher. Okay. These are the three main ones we're going to use. If I were to add average fixed costs, I'm just going to put it in a different color because it's a little less useful. It's going to have this kind of shape. Okay. So these are the different cost curves, and we will see that this first portion where it goes down, this downward portion, is due to specialization once again. And why the costs start creeping up the more output I want to produce, this portion over here is due to diminishing marginal product of labor. Okay. The next video is going to look at the relationship between these cost curves and why it's crossing at this lower point once again, and why this AFC keeps on going downwards. And hopefully you'll be able to understand these cost curves clearly, especially all the ones in purple, because they will be extensively used in chapters 9, 10, and 11.